All right, so picture this. You're a small business owner, and you're finally ready to hire your first employee. It's super exciting, right? But hold on, before you go celebrating, there's a big question. You got to figure out first, how do you classify them? Hourly, salaried, exempt, non-exempt. It can feel like a real maze, and you've actually sent us an article from the unit consulting to help sort it all out.
Yeah, it's something every business owner has to deal with, and honestly, it's way more complicated than people think. This article does a great job of breaking it down, especially for small businesses here in Texas.
Exactly. And from what we're seeing, it seems like you're really trying to understand these classifications, especially, in the context of Texas employment law. Yeah. It's definitely a tricky area. Did you know that just because you pay someone a salary, it doesn't automatically mean they're exempt from overtime?
That's a huge misconception. I see it all the time. There's specific rules and, what they call duties tests involved.
That sounds a little intimidating, but don't worry, we're going to break it all down for you. Let's start with the most straightforward category, non-exempt hourly.
Yeah, think of your typical hourly worker. They get paid for every hour they work, and if they clock in over 40 hours a week, bam, overtime pay kicks in. Usually time and a half. It's pretty simple, actually. The Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, lays out all the ground rules.
So we're talking about your retail workers, your restaurant staff, manufacturing folks who are punching a time clock and getting paid for every minute they're on the job. Make sense? I'm guessing keeping accurate records is super important here.
Absolutely crucial. Every hour worked has to be documented meticulously. Those time clocks and timesheets, they aren't just for show. It's about protecting both the employee and the employer. It makes sure everyone's on the same page about hours worked and wages earned.
All right, let's move on to a category that often trips people up. Exempt salary. Yeah. This is where that whole salary equals exempt myth really takes hold.
Oh, yeah, it's a tricky one. Exempt employees are paid a salary, and they're generally not entitled to overtime no matter how many hours they work. But it's not as easy as just giving someone a salary and calling it a day.
So what's the catch?
Yeah.
What actually makes someone exempt?
It all boils down to those duties tests we mentioned earlier. The employee's job responsibilities have to fit into very specific categories outlined by the Department of Labor. They're often called white-collar exemptions, and we'll get into those a bit later.
Okay, white-collar exemption. So we're thinking executives, managers, professionals, people who typically have more autonomy and decision-making power in their roles. But even then, it's not a guarantee, right? The article had a really interesting example about this.
Right. Just because someone has a fancy title doesn't automatically make them exempt. Imagine a salaried manager at a fast food restaurant working like 60 hours a week. They might sound exempt, but if their main duties aren't things like managing others, making independent judgments requiring specialized knowledge, well, they could actually be misclassified.
That's a perfect example. It really shows how you can't just look at a job title. You have to understand what someone actually does day to day.
Exactly. And that's why knowing those duties tests inside and out is so important. Having some expert guidance can be incredibly helpful too.
Now, speaking of potentially confusing situations, let's tackle the third category, non-exempt salary. This one seems like a bit of a head-scratcher.
Yeah, it can be. Picture an employee who gets a fixed salary, but they're still eligible for overtime. It's a combo that throws a lot of people off.
So they get the stability of a salary, but also the fairness of being paid for extra hours they put in. Sounds like a win-win, but I imagine the calculations can get a little complex.
You're right. It's often used for roles where someone might have pretty consistent hours, but occasionally has to put in some extra time. Think about certain administrative or technical positions. And yeah, figuring out overtime for salaried employees involves a bit more math. Basically, you convert their salary to an hourly rate and then calculate overtime based on that.
I'm starting to get a clearer picture of these three main categories. But before we dive too deep into overtime calculations, let's take a step back and explore those white-collar exemptions in more detail. They seem to be at the heart of determining who's exempt and who isn't.
Absolutely. Understanding these exemptions is key to making sure you're classifying your employees correctly and avoiding legal problems down the road. And it's not just about protecting your business, it's about ensuring your employees are treated fairly and compensated properly for their hard work. Okay, so let's unpack these exemptions. There are 6 main categories, outlined by the Department of Labor, each with its own set of criteria.
6 categories?
Yeah.
Wow. It's starting to feel like there's a whole secret code to this employee classification thing. Where do we even start?
Well, let's start with the one that probably comes to mind first, the executive exemption. Think of those folks who are really in charge, steering the ship.
Okay, so we're talking CEOs, high-level managers, those kinds of roles. But I'm guessing it's more than just having a fancy title.
Exactly. It goes beyond just the title. A big part of it is their authority to direct the work of at least 2 or more full-time employees, or the equivalent. They need to have real decision-making power when it comes to things like hiring, firing, setting the overall direction for the team.
So it's about having a real impact on how the business runs and the people in it. Makes sense. What about the administrative exemption? How is that different?
The administrative exemption covers employees who do office or non-manual work, directly related to managing or running the business itself. Think finance, accounting, marketing, HR, legal, all those behind-the-scenes functions that keep things running smoothly.
Got it. So we're shifting from managing people to managing essential operations. What kind of responsibilities would fall under this exemption?
Well, a key element here is the need for independent judgment and discretion. These people aren't just following orders, they're making important decisions that affect the company. They might be developing policies, analyzing data, negotiating contracts, or handling other tasks that require a high level of autonomy and expertise.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the professional exemption always seemed pretty broad to me. Like it could cover so many different types of jobs.
You're right, it is broad. But it's actually split into 2 categories: learned professionals and creative professionals. Think doctors and lawyers on one hand, and artists and musicians on the other.
Oh, okay. So it's about recognizing specialized knowledge and skills in different fields. What makes someone a learned professional then?
These are individuals with advanced knowledge in a specific field, usually acquired through a lot of education and training. Your doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, those professions that require a deep understanding of complex concepts and principles.
And what about creative professionals? What sets them apart?
For creative professionals, it's all about the work itself. It has to require invention, imagination, originality, or talent in, a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. We're talking about artists, musicians, writers, even some journalists. It's about recognizing that their expertise can't really be measured by a time clock or standardized procedures.
It's interesting how these exemptions recognize different types of expertise, the unique contributions of both analytical and creative minds.
Exactly. Now, with technology being so central to business these days, I'm really curious about the computer employee exemption. Who does that apply to?
Yeah, that one seems particularly relevant in today's world.
This exemption is for employees who are deep into the technical side of computer systems and software. Your systems analysts, programmers, software engineers, the people who are designing, testing, and modifying the technology that powers our digital world.
So it's not about someone who just uses a computer all day for their work, but those who are creating and maintaining the systems themselves. It's a very specific skill set, for sure.
Absolutely. And it's a field that's always changing, which makes staying up to date on the latest technologies and best practices even more important. All right, let's step away from the computers for a minute and talk about the outside sales exemption. This one's a little different because it focuses on where the work is happening rather than the specific tasks involved.
So as the name suggests, it means working outside of a typical office setting.
You got it. This exemption applies to employees whose main job is making sales or getting orders or contracts, and they're doing it out in the field, face-to-face with clients. Think traveling salespeople, pharmaceutical reps, those who are out there building relationships and closing deals in person.
It's cool how this exemption really highlights the importance of that direct personal interaction in some sales roles.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the unique nature of their work and how it contributes to the company's success. And last but not least, we have the highly compensated employee exemption, which, as you might guess, takes into account how much these individuals are paid.
So if you're making bank, you're automatically exempt from overtime, right? I feel like there's got to be more to it than that.
You're catching on. While high compensation is a factor, it's not the only thing. These employees have to be earning a pretty substantial annual salary, way above the regular salary threshold. But they also need to regularly perform at least one of those key exempt duties we've talked about, like managing others or exercising independent judgment.
So it's a combination of high pay and a certain level of responsibility and autonomy in their role. It's not just about the number on their paycheck.
Exactly. It recognizes that even people making a lot of money might be entitled to overtime if their job duties don't meet specific criteria. It's about being fair and preventing companies from just using a high salary as an excuse to avoid paying overtime for lots of hours worked.
Wow, this whole exemption thing is definitely more complex than I initially thought.
Mhm.
Seems like there's so many little details and room for misinterpretation.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to have a solid understanding of these exemptions and to get expert advice when you're not sure. Misclassifying employees can lead to big legal and financial problems, not to mention damage to employee morale and trust.
I can see why the article emphasizes the value of working with HR experts like the unit consulting. They really specialize in navigating these complexities and helping businesses stay compliant.
Exactly. They can provide valuable insights, conduct those important audits, and offer custom solutions that are tailored to each business's specific needs.
It's like having a trusted guide to help you through this complicated landscape. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground here exploring those 6 white-collar exemptions in detail. My brain is officially full, but I have a feeling there's still more to learn about ensuring compliance and avoiding those legal headaches.
You're right on the mark. Compliance is an ongoing process, and there are specific things businesses can do to proactively stay on the right side of the law. We'll dive into those next, and I think you'll find some valuable takeaways that you can apply to your own situation.
All right, so we've explored like all the ins and outs of employee classifications, those white-collar exemptions, the whole non-exempt salary thing. But now let's talk about what it all means in the real world. How can businesses actually make sure they're staying compliant and creating a fair workplace, for their employees?
Compliance is so important. It's not just about, avoiding legal trouble. It's about treating your employees right and building a culture of respect and fairness.
The article really emphasizes regular audits as a key part of staying compliant. What does that actually involve?
Think of it like a checkup for your employee classifications. Businesses need to regularly review things like job descriptions, pay structures, and what employees actually do on the job. Make sure everything lines up with current regulations and exemptions.
So it's not a one-time thing. You have to keep an eye on things. As roles change, people take on new responsibilities, and laws get updated.
Exactly. The business world's always changing, so your approach to classifying employees needs to adapt too.
The article also mentioned training. I bet that plays a big role in making sure everyone's on the same page.
Definitely. Training is crucial for HR staff and managers who are, directly involved in making these classification decisions. They need to really understand those duties, test the different exemptions, and what could happen if they miss.
Speaking of creating a fair and transparent workplace, what about keeping employee handbooks and policies up to date? That seems pretty important for staying compliant.
You're absolutely right. As laws and regulations change, businesses need to update their internal documents to reflect those changes. This includes things like, clearly outlining job descriptions, pay policies, overtime procedures, and any company-specific rules about employee classification.
It sounds like staying compliant is an ongoing effort that requires attention to detail, a commitment to fairness, and being willing to adapt to new regulations. It can feel like a lot, especially for smaller businesses that might not have dedicated HR departments.
Yeah, you're hitting on a key point. That's where working with HR experts like the unit consulting can make a huge difference. They can offer guidance, conduct those essential audits, and come up with the solutions that fit each business's specific needs.
It's like having a trusted advisor to help you navigate all this complexity and make sure you're doing right by your employees and your business.
Exactly. They take the guesswork out of compliance so you can focus on what you do best running your business.
So if any of our listeners are feeling lost in the world of employee classifications or just want some expert support to make sure they're on the right track, the unit consulting is here to help. They even offer a free consultation to see how they can best support you.
You can give them a call at 956-230-6866.
Going through all this, I've realized how much I've learned myself. It's fascinating how something that seemed so simple at first, like classifying employees, is actually so nuanced and complex.
It's definitely a journey. And the more you understand these classifications, the better you'll be able to create a fair and legally sound work environment for yourself and your team. Remember, knowledge is power.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from those 3 main categories to the 6 white-collar exemptions and everything in between. It feels a lot less confusing now, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to take what they've learned and apply it to their own careers and businesses.
It's been great diving into this with you. And remember, if you're ever unsure, don't hesitate to reach out to the experts.